Today we're going to have a look at the islands of the Pacific, the places where the United States fought and won World War II. They are specks on the map, as you can see there, but they encompass 1/5 of the world's surface. And they're now the setting for a great power competition between the United States and China. Kathryn Paik from the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington will kick off the panel by sketching out the challenges facing the incoming Trump administration. She knows these islands from the air and from the ground. She was in the Marines for 23 years. She served as a combat pilot, a helicopter pilot in Iraq. And then she later choppered or traveled by other means to many of the Pacific Islands. She was also the Marine military attaché in Indonesia, and more recently served at the White House National Security Council as director for Southeast Asia and the Pacific. She has degrees from the U.S. Naval Academy and the Naval Postgraduate School. And besides everything else, she speaks Mandarin and Indonesian. Following Kathryn is Daniel Stoian, who is a member of the Senior Foreign Service. He currently directs the Office of Management Strategy and Solutions at the State Department. In one of his previous posts, he oversaw 27 missions in South Asia and Central Asia. He's also served in very senior posts in management at the department, and he's worked abroad in Saudi Arabia, Rwanda, Tunisia, and Bahrain. He's a graduate of the University of California, Davis, and the Harvard Business School. And his languages include, it's amazing we could do this, we could have this event in Chinese tonight, Arabic, well, maybe we couldn't. We could do it in French, perhaps. Arabic, French, and Romanian. He will address what the United States government is doing now in the small islands, and what it can do to catch up with China in the Indo-Pacific region. We'll begin first with Kathryn. What is the challenge ahead?
Thank you to Baltimore CFA for having us tonight, and thank you so much for coming to listen to what I think is a really important topic about a critical region that is often overlooked in our quite overlooked in our system and in DC circles. So thank you again for being part of this tonight. I like maps. I think they're really helpful. This is a region that is especially helpful to have a map. I've worked this region intimately for about 4 years plus now, and I still have a map in my office right next to me that I refer to regularly. The islands are incredibly small relative to the ocean around them, but the reason I like this map and the following one, and I'll bring this one up later as well. I know this is a little fuzzy, but these are the EEZs, the exclusive economic zones, for those that are unfamiliar with that term. That is 200 nautical miles off of any landmass, and it is the waters in which a country controls the resources and the maritime resources. Other countries can transit innocently through those waters, but those are owned by those countries. So it is an interlocking map of EEZs across the entire Pacific. So just something to keep in mind as we talk about the strategic importance. So for those of you that follow the news, strategic competition, great power competition, you may have noticed that in the last couple of years, the Pacific has really exploded onto the scene. It's sort of a niche area that people maybe only think of in context of history, World War II, but any student of World War II will know the strategic importance of this region. This region has always been important to the United States. It is something, as was mentioned in the introduction, it covers almost 20% of the world's surface. Tons of U.S. goods and product run through the Pacific. It is the bridge between the United States and all of our Indo-Pacific allies and our bases in the Philippines, in Japan. In any conflict of the future, it would be extremely important. When we look back at World War II, there's a reason why the Pacific was so highly fought, and I'll go into that a little bit later. However, U.S. influence and presence across the Pacific has long been taken for granted. Until quite recently, in fact, it was assumed that this was not a region that we had to worry too much about, that our influence was stable and that of our allies and partners was stable in the Indo-Pacific. And I'll talk a little bit about why that's changed. So I thought I'd start, I don't want this to be a history lesson, and I am mindful of time, but I'm just going to review a couple points looking back over the last few decades of Pacific engagement and then how we've gotten to where we've gotten to in the last few years. I mentioned history. The Pacific is peppered with battle sites, as many of you all are familiar, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, et cetera. It's there for a reason. Halting the Japanese advance into the South Pacific was essential to ensure allied nations such as Australia and New Zealand were neither surrounded nor cut off from supply by hostile forces. And our wins in the Pacific reversed the tide of the war and arguably provided a base to launch a counteroffensive. Those lessons did not go unseen by China and others around the world. And as we look to the interest that China has started to have in the region, I think there's good reason for that historically. Post-World War II, our engagement was primarily centered around the shift from trusteeships to independent countries. One thing to keep in mind, you may have heard of COFA, the Compact of Free Association with Palau, Republic of Marshall Islands, and Federated States of Micronesia. I won't go into too much detail. There's a lot of reading out there on that. But that has been highly in the news. Those are unique relationships the United States has with those three countries. They are independent countries, but because of our compacts with them, we have unilateral defense access. And if I had a laser pointer, I could show you that Palau is over there by Papua New Guinea. And then you've got FSM and RMI extending almost the entire width of the Pacific there. So basically, it ensures unilateral U.S. defense access across the Pacific, essential to our ties in the region. The Pacific was also the site of extensive nuclear testing by the U.S., also something to keep in mind as we look at our relationships and the complexities there. Between 1946 and 1962, we had 67 nuclear tests during that time in the Marshall Islands, 33 other tests by the U.S. and the U.K. in the Kiribati, and on the Maldives Islands of Kiribati as well. So again, complex issues, a lot to go into. I won't go into detail on that one, but something to keep in mind. But overall, this period was largely defined by checkbook diplomacy. It was, they're taken care of. We've got some basic funding that we send out to the region. But bottom line, for years, the Pacific Island region suffered from strategic neglect from the United States and Washington. And Beijing stepped into that power vacuum, moving to increase influence and project its power across the region. So China has been expanding its engagement with the Pacific over the last decade, but was not really seen as a threat to the U.S. and allied influence until near the end of the 2010s. Specifically, the countries of Kiribati and Solomon Islands switched recognition from Taiwan to the PRC in a real big strategic coup that took the U.S. a little bit by surprise. Around that time, the U.S. policy circles started to really key in on this, and this was near the end of the first Trump administration. And we saw under the first Trump admin the establishment of the Compacts of Free Association negotiation team to renegotiate those important agreements. 3 of those leaders came to the White House. So that was really the start of this re-engagement. Under the Biden administration, we had an acceleration of that engagement. This was all part of the broader umbrella of the way that administration looked at the Indo-Pacific, which was central around partners and allies and central around multilateral institutions. And from that lens, the Pacific itself lent itself to this increased engagement by the Biden administration to ensure that we started to shift the tide a little bit. That engagement was accelerated even further in 2022. For those of you that aren't aware, the PRC established a security agreement that still remains secret, the text does, with the Solomon Islands, the home of Guadalcanal. And so the Solomon Islands now has a security arrangement with the PRC, and the PRC has had a police force on the ground in the Solomon Islands for roughly 3 years now, able to operate and work with the government. So that really set off alarm bells in the U.S. That set off huge alarm bells in Australia, which up until that time had basically said, this is our area, we've got it, don't worry, U.S., we've got all the engagement. It switched that 180 and also changed the way that the U.S. and Australia started working together in the region. So the last 4 years, what we really saw was engagement defined by a few key components. One was marshaling the resources and attention from across the interagency. As you might expect, there's a lot of people in the U.S. government that had never even heard of the Pacific Islands, much less thought twice about them, right? Usually the Pacific might have been one person assigned to thinking about the islands in the entire Indo-Pacific team, or worse yet, maybe one person for the Indo-Pacific that had to maybe sometimes think about the Pacific Islands. So that started to change, and that was something that I took on fully at the National Security Council, running the Pacific team there. Second was engagement with partners and allies and trying to do that more effectively. Again, this was a key component of this last administration and frankly of several last few U.S. administrations. How are we working with Australia? How are we working with New Zealand? Other countries are similarly alarmed with what is happening. So Japan has been a huge proponent of trying to do more in the Pacific. Japan has been trying to do more unilaterally, has been pushing us to do more. South Korea is looking to open a couple new embassies in the Pacific. India, even the EU and Canada were interested in doing more with us. So we formed what's called the Partners in the Blue Pacific, which was a strategically minded group of countries looking to coordinate our efforts better in the Pacific Islands region. The other thing was really big promises, just to put it out there. President Biden hosted all of the Pacific Island leaders, 18 of them, at the White House twice during his tenure. And during that time, we saw huge promises put on the table. The tuna treaty renegotiation up to $65 million for the region. COFA renegotiated for $7.2 billion over the next 20 years. I could go on and on. Other pieces of this, reopening or opening new embassies in the region. And Danny can go into this further. That's when I started to work with Danny at State Department more intensely on this, because our embassy presence in the region is woefully underrepresented. We shifted a USAID mission to the region, bringing back the Peace Corps, lots of ways across the board there. And the other one was high-level visits and trying to engage really at the highest level. So we've got a lot of things in train, but my main message today really is, even if we do all of those things that we have put on the board thus far, it is not going to be enough. It's just not going to be enough. China has been working extremely hard in the region. They have still more embassies, more people on the ground. Just earlier this year, Nauru also switched recognition. They've got new security agreements going on underhanded across the region, trying to get dual use access to ports and facilities. Bottom line, in the Pacific, this is a numbers game, as it is everywhere when we talk about great power competition and working with partners and allies, right? It's a numbers game for the U.S., which is why we look at partners and allies so persistently. And yet in the Pacific, I'd argue that the numbers game is not in our favor, because while we have to block out everywhere, China only needs one security foothold, one piece of ground in one place, like Guadalcanal on Honiara, in order to really shift the calculus for the United States and for Australia. Australia is extremely keyed into this, and as is New Zealand and Japan. And so that's why it is not necessarily an easy fight, and we can't just whack-a-mole everywhere, but we've got to think strategically. So I've got just a few thoughts on sort of this next phase, looking now from the outside on what will be necessary to continue ramping this up. And then I'll turn it over to my colleague here to hear his thoughts from the inside on how that might look. But a few key components that we've still got to step up our game on. Diplomatic presence, that's on number one. So we've opened 3 embassies over the last few years, but we're still slow to get ambassadors out there. And that's not just a State Department thing, that's not just a White House thing, that's a congressional thing. This is a joint effort across the board. It has to be a whole of government effort. Even where we have embassies, China usually outnumbers us, people on the ground, by about 10 to 1. So they will have 30 people, we'll have 2. So just, when we think about influence is presence, and presence means presence on the ground. It doesn't mean virtual presence. It doesn't mean fly in, fly out. We've got to remember that we are a Pacific nation. We say that often, but we have to be a Pacific nation. So we have 3 territories. We have 1 state that are in the Pacific. And, you know, they're all, I think Hawaii's not on this map, but Guam, CNMI, and American Samoa are on this map. We have more than 2 million Americans that call a Pacific Island home, right? But we bifurcate when we look at our U.S. government efforts and our U.S. efforts. We think of international and we think of domestic. And yet in the Pacific, challenges go cross borders. People and cultures are cross borders. We have to think more creatively about our education space, the health space, the media space across the board. Regionalism is extremely important in the Pacific. They have something called the Pacific Island Forum, which is their main regional architecture. That, just like ASEAN in Southeast Asia, for those that are familiar with ASEAN, the PIF, the Pacific Island Forum, allows these many small countries and islands to band together and push back together against larger powers. We saw this in 2022. China sent their foreign minister to try to do secret deals. They wanted to do a swath of security deals with the entire Pacific Island grouping, and they pushed back. They said, that's not how you deal with us as a group. But they were only able to do that because they were a strong group, and so the U.S. has an interest in engaging with the Pacific Island Forum and keeping it strong. Lastly, I think the biggest challenge moving forward will be climate change. That is an existential threat to these countries. They consider it their number 1 national security threat. That is going to be an extreme challenge, obviously, for the Trump administration, but this was also a challenge even previously. The Pacific Islands were extremely disappointed by the international community at this recent COP 29 in Central Asia this past year, because they saw even the Biden administration not doing enough to meet their extreme needs. Some of these countries might disappear by 2050. That's just a fact. They are extremely dependent on their maritime resources, and they are not the emitters, and yet they're the main vulnerable nations throughout the world. So they are depending on the U.S. to take leadership on that. So what is that going to look like? Listen, I think this is going to have to be a tricky line for this next administration to walk. I do think there are some solutions. I think there are some ways to talk about the climate-related challenges and needs that the Pacific Islands have outside of the climate lens. A lot of this is infrastructure, critical infrastructure, cables, ICT, ports, resilient roads against erosion and extreme weather events. I mean, these are areas that we do not want China or other actors getting involved in. And so I think there are ways to frame this differently for a U.S. system. But this is something that's going to be a real challenge looking ahead. Failing to do so, however, will leave space for China. And they're perfectly ready and willing to swoop in to that. So I think I'll leave it there. I know I've talked for quite a bit. There's a lot of information here. I have a lot of notes I didn't even go into. Let me just switch over one more time just to this map again. Because again, I think this, when you keep it in mind, we've got Australia over there, Hawaii's right over here, interlocking EEZs, basically ownership of those maritime resources across the board. They do not have the capacity or the ability to monitor those maritime zones. We're trying to help them with that. Our Coast Guard, which I very much hope gets ramped up in coming years, does an excellent job helping them, as do Australia and New Zealand. But extremely vulnerable across the board. I'll put it back on the main map and turn it over to my colleague.
Okay, so Kathryn made a great case for why we need to be present, and I'm going to tell you how flippin' difficult it is to actually make that happen. So as Kathryn described, right, in the last administration, there was this clear indication we need to be present in these places. But just to give you kind of an idea of what that means to be present, right? So for a U.S. embassy to open up, that's usually minimum 5 to 7 years project, starting at about $50 million, right? That's how we do something. And what we're looking for is minimum 100-foot setback, right? And in a place like Kiribati, I'll tell you that any place you stand on the thin strip island, 300 yards to your left is the ocean and 300 yards to your right is the ocean. So trying to figure out how do you construct an embassy in those conditions, right, is just, and most of the embassy constructions, if anybody's been to an embassy, would probably sink one of those islands, right? So like, it's just, how in the world do we do that in the current structure that we have is really, really difficult. We also have to have seismic compliance, right? And one of the things that Kathryn and I did really well is to cut through a lot of that, what we would call red tape, right? And to say it's so important, it's so strategically important that we need to lower the standards from ADA compliance, fire hazards, seismic abilities. We're going to limit the A&E construction reviews. So that's what we did in Vanuatu, right? Unfortunately, was it a couple weeks ago in Vanuatu, there was an earthquake that completely flattened the embassy. So we're really lucky that nobody was in the embassy at the time, but that's kind of what we're now facing, of now having all the questions of saying, well, hold on, you guys said hurry up, but now we have a flattened embassy. And what if somebody was there? That would have totally changed the calculus and the conversation we'd be having, and the conversation that I have with the Hill or with any other kind of overlords in trying to get this stuff happening. And so those are real challenges, right? It's not just, I don't want to say that government bureaucracy doesn't exist, but it's not just government bureaucracy, right? It's contracting laws, it's these things. The other issue, as Kathryn rightly pointed out, so once we get an embassy up there, right, then we have to get it staffed. And these are places where, so if you have, right, I've got 2 kids that are in high school. Like, where would they go to school? Right, I really believe in this mission deeply. I really want to go out there. But where in the world my kids go to high school out there? You know, if they had even a toothache, right, even if they had like a toothache, they would have to be medevaced probably to Australia, to Brisbane, which in a place like Kiribati is maybe a flight twice a week to Fiji first, and then getting on another plane to Brisbane, Australia, right? Really, really challenging of figuring out how do we do those things. Now, of course, I'm not the profile of everyone in the Foreign Service, luckily, right? There are people at different stages in their life and different willingness. It's just harder, right? It's a lot harder to make happen. But nonetheless, what we did do is create a model for figuring out, and here's what I would also say, just to underscore what Kathryn is saying. So in the time that we've been deliberating this and figuring this stuff out, right, it's not in a vacuum. So in that time, just in Kiribati, right, the Chinese are going to rebuild the Canton airstrip. So this is a key airstrip that Kathryn referenced that we were using in World War II. That now the Chinese are going to rebuild, and I'm guessing, right, are going to have a little more access to that than we ever would. The police training, all of that is happening while somebody is not on the ground in those meetings and offering an alternative, right? It's not even as if like the U.S. government isn't marshaling resources. We're not even in the room to offer an alternative or to call back and say, hey, we need X, Y, and Z to be done so we can provide another option. But again, what we did do is we were able to figure out a way to limit what we said. Remember, it was like 5 years, $50 million to open up these embassies in less than a year and under $10 million. So there is a model for doing that. Again, the downside of it is, though, there are certain risks that we've just assumed, right? And it's these really, really difficult trade-offs. It's a really, really difficult trade-off. What is that right calculus? Anyway, those are ones that like our actuaries in the State Department, other ones, right? These are not conversations we want to have made public, right? Because they're really, really difficult conversations, but they need to take place. The other things we've done is just trying to figure out a new model for diplomacy, right? Of saying like, if it's pure numbers and purely traditionally, we're just always going to lose. We just can't put the same people in the same speed in the same way that the Chinese are able to do that. And so trying to figure out what is a new model for doing diplomacy, right? And one of them is leveraging AI. So trying to figure out, how do you provision visas in a different way? How do you provision visas? How do you do reports in a totally different way? And so we've leveraged AI to do lots of different reporting, lots of the public diplomacy work and the translation and the disseminating information, trying to leverage AI to do that. And we're just at the beginning of it, right? Or just at the tip of the iceberg of figuring out what we can do. But we definitely need to do that. Kathryn talked also about our allies in the region and leveraging those allies, of really doing it not, the British have an embassy, the South Koreans have an embassy, the Philippines have an embassy, the Australians have an embassy, the US have an embassy. Really trying to figure out, and we got really close to doing a co-location with the Australians in Tonga. Luckily, in the end, we ended up getting our own building, and that was great. But even the ability to say we can have a joint embassy where we would work together. We'd have both flags up. You'd work on one floor, we'd work on another floor. Those conversations, those abilities, is just a new way of thinking, and it just needs to happen. So we need to do a lot more of those. But again, to Kathryn's point, even if we do everything that Kathryn says, we can't keep up, right? And so I think thinking of this as the U.S. government is going to solve this challenge that we all face is just short-sighted thinking, right? So and having to shift the conversation of being the U.S. government is just one lever. It's an important lever, and we have to be there, but it is just one lever. The days that it has to be a U.S. ambassador and Danny Stoian as the official diplomat doing all the work is long gone. Like, that's that's an old school way of doing it, and we can't. And so the real thought is, what are the scholarships that we can provide, not just through the State Department, but all the different universities we have across the United States? How do we engage the academia to provide scholarships directly to a bunch of people from the Pacific Islands, to giving them experience in the United States? Medical missions, right? Not just waiting for the U.S. military to provide medical missions, right? But how do we have hospitals in the United States doing medical missions? The Chinese government does that. They had recently a peace arc that went around the Pacific Islands. There's no reason we can't do that. That is not dependent on the U.S. government, and trying to figure out and where we need to shift. And I'd love to see Kathryn is helping to do this push of figuring out, of trying to leverage and moving the State Department and the U.S. government to being a facilitator rather than the only actor, but of saying, also sister city programs, tourism, right? Of how many of you thought about tourism in the Pacific Islands and trying to figure out how can the U.S. government help facilitate that, show what those options are, show what that looks like, and then investment, right? Figuring out ways that we can show investment opportunities, joint businesses, all those kind of stuff. So I think the key one is just not relying just on the U.S. government. Even our current secretary, Marco Rubio, in his confirmation hearing said that we need to leverage private sector engagement, right? Of trying to figure out ways that, whether it's academia, the private sector, NGOs, individual citizens, how do we leverage all of the U.S. forces to engage on this? But anyway, let me stop there and leave it all for your questions, because we'd love to take your questions.
Well, thank you both for an extremely helpful and worrying presentation. I just want to ask one question about the seriousness of both political parties in this country about dealing with the Pacific. It wasn't that long ago that there was a discussion about having a trans-Pacific trade partnership, which is a kind of thing that is in government but also outside of government. And both parties backed away from it. What happened? Have things changed? Is that partnership, does it exist? Did it come about, or could it come about?
The TPP still exists in a form without the U.S. in it. It's now the CPTPP, the Comprehensive I'll just leave it there. The CPTPP, and involves a lot of the original players. I should note that I think the UK just joined this year. China is angling to join, as is Taiwan. There's been heavy lobbying by our partners and allies to have the U.S. reconsider. I don't think, for a variety of reasons, that is at all in the cards for us. Neither side of the aisle seems to be interested for different reasons. And I just don't, I think that's too heavy of a lift. I will go broader than that and say that I think one of the areas we really struggle more broadly across the entire Indo-Pacific, certainly not just in the Pacific, is on the economic piece. I also covered Southeast Asia. I don't want to get into that. I know this is on the Pacific today, but we are working very well in the security realm, in some of the other realms, people to people, but the economic piece is severely lacking from a U.S. perspective. For the Pacific Islands, the TPP was not going to involve them per se. I should note that the IPEF, which I would expect will not exist anymore if it hasn't already been demolished. Yeah, but that was the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that was formed under the Biden administration. It was not a trade agreement. However, it did loop in, it was dealing with other aspects of an economic engagement, and it did loop in Fiji, specifically because it looked to how do we bring the Pacific Islands into the loop on this. Most Pacific Islands are just not going to be developed enough economically that they will be able to take part in high-level trade negotiations like that. But getting back to Danny's point, there's a real need to engage the private sector, especially business and industry, to look at some of the niche areas that they can engage the Pacific on. The Pacific is very, very eager to try to engage with us economically at a more wholesome level.
Good evening, and thank you both for coming. An observation and a question. The observation is I'd like to see an overlay on your maps of the Belt and Road Initiative and the 9-line. Thank you. And you read my mind. And then the question is, can you speak to the collaboration on nuclear submarines that apparently has been one of the manifestations of U.S. projection of power?
Fortunately, the 9-dash line does not appear on here because it is not on this map. 9-dash line goes through South China Sea. Definitely a major issue.
And what is the 9-dash
Oh,
line?
the 9-dash line, for anyone not familiar, is basically China's drawing depiction of what their ownership of the South China Sea. So if you just Google 9-dash line, it's never been formalized by China for good reason. It tends to change. Sometimes it's a 10-dash line, sometimes it goes here, sometimes it goes there. But essentially, China claims most of the South China Sea, including many other EEZs around the area, as their own maritime zone. And so you can imagine some of the difficulties that come from that. On the BRI, that's a great question. There has been quite a bit of BRI activity within the Pacific. China has done quite a lot of loans and debt trap loans throughout the region. Tonga, for example, is extremely in debt to China, although also in debt, in fairness, to many other countries as well. In recent years, though, I should note, this past year, China, I think behind Australia, was the biggest donor, and not of loans, of actual grants, which is a big shift for China in the Pacific specifically. And I think that speaks to the adeptness of the PRC in learning how to engage the region in a way that the region is looking to be engaged. So that's something for us to be highly aware of as well. And I think, did you have one other question? Oh, the AUKUS, yes. So that's AUKUS, the agreement between Australia, US, and the UK. It's something in my day job I cover quite a bit. Won't go into too much detail here. I will note that, so that is moving along. That's the sale of US submarines to Australia, the transfer of nuclear technology for the first time in decades. This is a huge deal, one of the major components of the last administration, one that I think is likely to continue, although we have not heard for sure Trump's own stance on this, although I believe Rubio in his confirmation hearing did express support for it. It's an extremely important endeavor in our strategic outlook as we look to posture vis-a-vis China. But on AUKUS, because it involves nuclear submarines, even though these are not nuclear-armed submarines, these are just nuclear-powered submarines, and that's an important note. It does not contravene any of the international agreements on nuclear on nuclear technology. However, the Pacific Islands, because of their history, as I mentioned, of nuclear testing, this was quite tense when it first was announced. A lot of that was messaging we saw coming out of China and influence messaging that they were doing throughout the region, not just in the Pacific, but in Southeast Asia as well, on this is the U.S. bringing nuclear weapons into your AOR. So there was a lot of cleanup that the U.S. and Australia have been trying to do in the region around that. Now, that's gone pretty well. I think most of the Pacific understands now where we stand on that. But that was a really interesting note in terms of how China used something we were doing to try to turn it against us.
Yeah, I'll echo that. Thanks for joining us tonight. You both covered a lot about the diplomatic instrument of national power. But just a couple things. One, what about the role of intelligence sharing, specifically looking at like the Four Eyes, which includes Australia, Five Eyes, which adds New Zealand, looking at bilateral agreements with like South Korea, Japan, and then the military instrument of national power. So the U.S. Marine Corps frequently does exercise with Cobra Gold in Thailand. It now has a permanent, albeit small, presence in Australia, pretty significant presence in Okinawa, the Air Force's presence in Japan as well as South Korea, and the Army's presence in South Korea. So can these be used to perhaps hedge against some of our challenges with maybe lack of diplomatic outposts in some of these countries?
Yeah, I'm happy to start with that, and then Kathryn maybe jump in. But yeah, I think everyone recognizing the threat has increased so much incredible sharing. So most surprising was Japan, is how much intel sharing there is now, how much even just kind of sharing on grants, right, on the aid project. What are you going to take on? What are we going to take on? And trying to have those aid projects discussed as a series of allies. So that stuff is happening a lot more. Part of what we're trying to do as we set up an embassy, right, is the embassy is almost like the headquarters for the U.S. government engagement, and trying to make that an infrastructure that allows for other people to plug in. Right now, at best, we have interagencies that can plug in. Even that is tough, of having different parts of the U.S. military being able to plug into a U.S. embassy. So that part we've solved somewhat, not perfectly, and now trying to figure out how do we get other countries to be able to plug in, and similarly, how do we plug in, even something as simple as how do I, as a U.S. diplomat, figure out a way to walk into a Japanese embassy or a South Korean embassy and be able to sit down on their country team. And so those kind of structural, administrative mechanisms are being worked out. And so there's happening, I don't know, Kathryn, how you would compare that to when you first started on this and then now. It's night and day. It's no comparison. It's happening so much right now. Yeah.
Yeah, completely agree. Specifically, when we look at the Pacific Islands region, for example, New Zealand, Australia, and the U.S. Over the last few years have extensively ramped up their intel sharing on the region. Australia and New Zealand have a much better idea a lot of times of what's going on, partially because they have embassies everywhere, they have people on the ground everywhere, and we just don't. So we are highly dependent on their outlook. But similarly, they often were looking to us for our ideas. We started regular meetings when I was at the NSC between all of senior level meetings between the intel components of our countries, and we looped in Japan as well, as Danny was saying, specifically looking at what are some of the vulnerabilities, what are some of the most recent threats we're seeing in the Pacific. Great question on the bilateral relationships and some of the multilateral relationships when we look beyond. As I mentioned, Japan, Korea, even India through the Quad is starting to be much more interested in the Pacific Islands region. There's a lot of activity also happening in Southeast Asia. Again, tonight's discussion is on Pacific, so I don't want to go too much into that. But a lot of these multilateral groupings are much more heavily focused on what is happening in the Pacific. I should also note something we've seen develop over the last few years that's been really interesting that I think we'll only see continue under this administration is multilateral groupings external to the U.S. For example, Australia, Japan, the Philippines. We've seen that trilateral grouping start to do more together. Australia, Philippines, Japan. And that's only in the U.S. interest. That's a really great development. It's less of a hub and spoke model now where the U.S. has to be the center of everything and our partners and allies are working together. It's more of a lattice work is how we like to look at it. And that not only takes some of the burden off of the U.S., but also if there's changes in U.S. administration, whatnot, there can still be consistency for a lot of these partners. Last note on defense presence, again, well noted across the region. The Pacific is really interesting. Only 3 of the 14 countries have their own militaries, Fiji, Tonga, and Papua New Guinea. The rest do not have militaries. They do have police forces, law enforcement. So our engagement with them really comes much more effectively through our Coast Guard. And through maritime law enforcement and security forces, working at INL, its State Department, for example, or Department of Homeland Security. So again, this gets back to that creative engagement piece and how we're looking to engage with these different countries.
Subic Bay used to be a huge American naval base in the Philippines, and then, if I remember correctly, the Philippines changed in government, they kicked us out, or it was closed. But we're back on friendly terms with the Philippines. What's happening with Subic Bay? And more importantly, can you elaborate on the impact of climate change and how these low-lying Pacific islands see both China and the United States and the future of helping them with climate change?
Yeah, in terms of a great question on the Philippines, I think if there's one country in Southeast Asia that has had such the biggest transformation in our bilateral relationship, it's been with the Philippines over the last few years. If we look at 2020 to now, 2020 we had Duterte in power. He was threatening to cancel the VFA and kick us out altogether. And now we have 5 new EDCA sites with the Philippines. We're working hand in hand with them in the South China Sea, helping them with the Coast Guard pushing back on China in the South China Sea. So just really very interesting times. I can't speak specifically to Subic Bay. That's not something I'm tracking at the moment. But I do know that our military-to-military relationship and defense relationship with the Philippines is on an upward trajectory at the moment, and the relationship is quite good. Climate change, that's a fantastic question and very, very relevant. China is one of the biggest emitters, as is the U.S., right? the biggest at the moment. However, they're also one of the biggest producers of renewable energy and exporters of renewable energy, and they're leading the way on solar and wind power. The U.S. just withdrew from the Paris Agreement. This was across the region. This reverberated. So from a climate angle, we've got a real uphill battle reputationally in the Pacific. That said, these are pragmatic countries. These are democratic countries. They are very aware of how China does operate, and most of them still would prefer to work with the U.S. We just have to offer them options. Because if we are not offering them options, if we're not at the table, like Danny said, if we don't have people on the ground able to say, we can rebuild this airfield and we're not going to put you in debt while we do it, and we can't deliver, they're going to have to go with what they can get, which is from China.
Is there any opportunity for increasing World War II tourist traffic in the Pacific? And the second question being, what role, if any, does the Carter Center at George Mason University and the National Institute of Peace play in advancing American diplomacy in the Pacific Islands?
Yeah, it's terrible to pick up the mic to say, that's a great question, I don't know. But I will say, on the opportunity for tourism, I think that is something that I'm going to put our embassies on the hook to say, someone should send me an email, and whoever asked that question, let's make that happen. I don't know of any effort on that, but that is, I know that our embassies are eager to try to facilitate the tourism. Yeah, so I haven't heard of that, but that would be, it's great.
No, we do have some beautiful, so in Guadalcanal, so I was there for the 80th anniversary in Guadalcanal 2 years ago now, and we have actually quite a beautiful memorial there, as does the Japanese. So we did it was really beautiful. We had the U.S. memorial. We had, I think it was over a dozen Marine generals, active duty, there in uniform. We took up the two main hotels on the island and went to a service there, and then the Japanese hosted a service at their own memorial. So I think there's definitely some room for that, and that's a great question, and I'll agree with Danny. I think that's something that we could capitalize more on, for sure. The countries certainly would like to do that. They are looking, tourism is one of their main, most countries, that's one of their main money makers, and something that suffered greatly under COVID. So they certainly would be interested in that. I also can't answer on the second. I'm not familiar with those programs. I will say, as Danny mentioned in his talk, we need to look beyond government, and university partnerships and educational opportunities are one of the main positive ways that we can engage with the region. Many people are familiar with the term elite capture. It's a negative term that's often references what China does with elites across the Pacific. It usually involves bags of cash and promises of power. It's a form of capturing the elite of a country. Well, I like to think of education as our form of elite capture, if you will. Without putting too much of a negative spin on it. When you provide educational opportunities, you bring people to your country, they learn about your country, you enhance those relationships. Those things never go away. And I think that's something that we need to capitalize on. It's one of our advantages.
As from what I've read, the long game in China's 9-dash line is resource extraction, but in the short term, it's a lot about fishing and protein extraction. Do any of these Pacific Island countries have a developed fishing fleet? Are they subsistence fishing? And is there a long-term resource extraction piece to this that China is going to try and edge us out on? And would that be conflicting for the Pacific Islanders, given that they are going to suffer from climate change far more than anyone else? So if they permit resource extracting, they're kind of committing to swimming.
Great question, very relevant. If you don't mind, I'll take this one first. So yes and yes. So most of these countries depend heavily on their fishing resources. I mentioned the tuna treaty that we renegotiated with the Pacific. In the past, we'd given them $20 million a year. Now it's $65 million a year, which is what they asked for. I won't go into the details of it, but essentially it's a treaty that allows us to fish in certain areas. They're very interested in maintaining renewable stocks and ensuring the health of their maritime resources. Many of them are also quite aware of and have been alerting the U.S. to illegal Chinese fleets operating in their fishing areas. Like I mentioned, that there's huge EEZs here to have to monitor. It's too much for even the U.S. to do by ourselves. We've talked, we're trying to work in conjunction with our P3s, our Coast Guard vessels. We brought a second Coast Guard vessel out to the region this past year to hopefully be permanently stationed out of Guam. So we're trying to look at ways that we can help these countries bolster their MDA, their maritime domain awareness. On the other resource extraction, also, yes. In fact, there's the whole issue of deep seabed mining is a hugely contentious issue in the Pacific. The Cook Islands and Nauru specifically have extensive deep sea nodules that exist of various minerals that are extremely important for a lot of newer technologies, and they're very eager to take advantage of those. Other Pacific islands are heavily against deep sea mining for also the reasons that you mentioned, potential environmental damage. The U.S. has not yet taken a position on this internationally, and it's something that will continue to rise to the fore. It will be something to watch, I think, with this administration. I would expect potentially a Trump administration to come down in favor of deep sea mining, which would be in line with many other countries in the world, I should note. China is currently buying up the exploratory rights to an excessive amount of deep sea mining opportunities across the world at the moment. So it's something for us to be very keyed in on and very concerned about.
Just to follow up, if they bought up the rights, do you think they have the clout in the region to enforce them?
So I can't say if they have most of the rights in the Pacific specifically. And again, most of the nodules in the Pacific fall within EEZs. And I think the rights that can be bought up, and I'm not an expert on this piece, so I'm getting a little out of my depth, no pun intended. But I think most of those rights involve outside of people's EEZs or countries' EEZs. But Nauru and Cook Islands, those are within their own EEZs.
So I think this question is directed at you, Danny, because based on your comments, I assume you're part of the current administration. Okay, perfect. So even though Taiwan is not part of the Pacific Island territories, the elephant in the room is, what is the Trump administration going to do relative to a potential attack of China on Taiwan? Do you have any insights or speculation on that?
Yeah. It's funny that you asked that after, am I still in the current administration? I think answering that will depend on if I answer the same.
Exactly.
Yeah, I might not be part of the administration. I actually don't know, and I haven't heard. Yeah,
Okay.
It's a great question. It's totally deserving of an answer. I can assure you there are people that are deeply thinking about this. I just am not in that circle. I don't know.
So Kathryn, you got any ideas?
This is one maybe we punt to. In a couple of months, we might have a good answer on that. And I think it actually would be good to, and we can do this, Roy, we'll identify who are the people that are working on China in this administration to come back and have that talk. Yeah, it would be really interesting.
Okay,
Good idea.
okay, thank you.
Does Australia manufacture automobiles? And if so, or if not, do you import most of your automobiles, and where do you get them from?
That's a really good question. I actually don't know about their automobile industry specifically. Do you know?
I don't know. I don't know of an Australian manufacturer. I just imagine that they must at least assemble them in Australia. They can't import all of those, right? Gosh, talk about out of the depth. I don't know. That's a great. Now I feel like.
I mean, what do you see on the roads? Do you see Fords and Chevys, or do you see Hondas and Kias and Subarus and Chinese cars, or what?
Not Chinese cars, but I think all of the above. To be honest, I don't pay attention too much to the cars when I'm out there. I probably should, but I haven't noticed any one particular style.
Yeah, I think we're now going to lose an hour of going back to the office and we're stumped. That's a great question. I really want to know.
Jesus.
Good evening, and thank you for the presentations. You mentioned leveraging partners, and Kathryn, you mentioned briefly that you are an expert in Southeast Asia. Or, well, I just want to ask, in the jockeying for influence over the Pacific Islands, what roles does Southeast Asia have, particularly organizations like ASEAN and member states like Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia? Because the relative proximity would imply that they would be a factor, and I just want to know whether they're a third player or they're siding with the U.S. or China.
This is a great question, and one that I've actually been thinking a lot about, both when I was in and now as well. So ASEAN, so a couple answers here. So the main Southeast Asian country that focuses and thinks about the Pacific Islands the most, I would say, is probably Indonesia, and that's because of Papua New Guinea. So Indonesia and Papua New Guinea share, so Papua is the western part of the island of Guinea, and that is Indonesian territory. Now, Papua is also, there's a lot of tension there, without going into too many details, but the relationship between Indonesia and Papua New Guinea itself, another country, and Papua New Guinea is one of the Pacific Islands, is highly contentious. For that reason, Indonesia is viewed with a little bit of suspicion by especially the Melanesian countries in the Pacific, which are Papua New Guinea, Fiji, New Caledonia, which is actually just a territory in the Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu. Indonesia's actually been doing a lot of diplomacy in that region. In fact, they just sent a hospital ship around a couple months ago to hit all of those countries and do a lot of good work. So smart work on their side, I think. So when Indonesia gets interested in doing more in the Pacific, it's often viewed with a little bit of skepticism and suspicion. Other countries, Singapore was quite interested in what we were doing in the Pacific. They're very strategically minded. A few others, like Vietnam, have also expressed some interest because they are aware that that's sort of at their backside, right? And they're very concerned with what China's doing over in the South China Sea. So they're not blind to the fact that China is also moving around in their rear. That said, they're pretty focused on what's happening in Southeast Asia and the South China Sea. There's not a whole lot of conversations back and forth. I personally think there is a lot to be said for trying to link up ASEAN and the PIF, to have the PIF learn some of the lessons from ASEAN and how they built out their architecture and how they engage with external partners. There's been some interest from ASEAN on doing that, but again, it's just been more of a bandwidth, I think, from Southeast Asia's perspective.
Instead of trying to build an embassy complex on small islands, would it be possible to install an embassy on board a converted commercial or naval vessel? This question assumes that there would be a reduced staff, however, increased mobility for the government to provide services where they are most needed.
Yeah, it's something we've explored. So there was even like cruise ships, right? Of thinking about, could we get a cruise ship? Could we get where we landed on one, the cost savings wasn't as much as we would have thought. And second, logistically it made a lot of sense. It didn't play out well in terms of the messaging, right? The messaging plays into the Chinese propaganda of saying like, look, they're just anchoring. They can pull up anchor and take off any time. And so the logic at that time was, I don't think this is going to play well. But there definitely is a possibility. We do this in different ways. So the way we've done this currently, right, is we have almost like mother embassies. There's got to be a better term for this, right? There's a larger embassy that is housed in Papua New Guinea, in Fiji, in Australia, that services these other embassies, or services these countries. We don't have staff. The problem we really want is persistent presence, and we want people to not live on a ship. We don't want people to live in Papua New Guinea and come over to Tonga every 3 months. We need persistence presence. So that's why at least for now, the ship idea, didn't sit.
But it sounds attractive, I'll say.
It sounds attractive, yeah. And to tell you the truth, so part of it we turned on the ship also because just housing staff was really challenging in some of these places. So the Chinese are able to put so many people because they also have 100 people at the embassy site bunking in the same place, right? And they're just all shipped in there, right? And so we would have different standards for how we put people up. And there just wasn't locations for all those people.
The only thing I'd add on to that is when we do think about services and the way we can move those around, that is something that sometimes comes into play. We think of that in terms of hospital services, for example, just to remote areas delivering dental work or eye exams. But there's also the possibility for things like visa services that embassies normally provide, right? But a lot of our embassies aren't going to be necessarily staffed large enough or even have the demand to need to be there every single day. But what if you are able to move them around and be a little bit more mobile? So whether it's on a ship or just another form of mobility, that's definitely a way to think about the Pacific. And it gets back to that creativity model.
So I have a question about China and its advantages and disadvantages. Obviously, they're in the area. Obviously, they have ambitions. Do you have a sense of what their and ambition is, other than just being the hegemonic power there? And what are the disadvantages that the Chinese bring to the table compared to the United States, for example?
So to the first question, in terms of ambitions, I think that's multifold. A lot of it comes down to resources. We've talked a lot about maritime resources, similar to the South China Sea, looking at fishing, maritime resources, deep sea mining, relationships, influence. I do believe, and I think it's our U.S. government, I can't speak for the U.S. government anymore, but it is certainly a general belief between us and many of our partners and allies that China is also looking to get a security foothold in the region. We've just seen too much evidence of that, of specifically targeting security forces, agreements, ability to bring in people on the ground that are security related, shaping the security architecture, getting dual use facilities. It's just, I don't see another reason beyond them wanting to have a physical presence and foothold for a potential contingency in the future. So that in terms of ambitions. In terms of disadvantages, China gets in their own way a lot. In fact, sometimes they can be our best ally in terms of making the case. We see this in South China Sea and in Southeast Asia as well. I mentioned that 2022 visit that the Chinese foreign minister did when he came out. The Pacific strongly values consultation. They are constantly wanting to be, you sit down, you consult, you listen. They have something called a talanoa where all the leaders sit in a circle and everyone gets to speak and everyone listens. And that's extremely important in the Pacific. And we had the Chinese foreign minister coming in and table dropping a agreement that he expected them to sign without any consultation or any ability to revise. We've tried very hard in the U.S. to work opposite to that when we do joint agreements. For example, during the first summit where we had all the leaders come to the White House, we sat in a room and consulted with them on every single word in the language and it capitulated, frankly, on everything that they wanted that frankly wasn't a big deal. We don't want to you had the word Indo-Pacific, we want it to be Pacific. Sure, whatever you guys want. And that was very well received in the Pacific. And so China has shown again and again that they don't quite get that piece of engagement. That said, like I said, they are learning and they are changing and they're getting better at that engagement piece on the ground. So while they have gotten in their own way and they've showed some disadvantages, the debt trap diplomacy has certainly been one. The infrastructure isn't necessarily that solid. It doesn't necessarily pan out. They'll build a hospital and not necessarily equip it with all the functioning items, but the U.S. isn't even building a hospital. So, you have to take it in stride, and it's great to start railing against what China is doing negatively, but if we're not offering something in return or as an alternative, we don't really have any leg to stand on.
Yeah, what I'll add is, so I think of the Chinese advantages more in terms of like, what is the work that I have to take on, right? Like, what does that mean that I need to return to the State Department and think about how we do things differently? So I think of three advantages that the Chinese are offering like these countries. One is that they're on message. They're incredibly on message, right? So they don't have to worry about, I hear one thing from the State Department, I hear something differently from DOD, then a different element of DOD, and it's just they understand, they're just all on message, right? So that is kind of something that we need to take on as the U.S. government to figure out how do we stay better on message, right? How do we have a cohesive strategy, which is 90% of Kathryn's headache at the NSC, of trying to wrangle all the agencies together to stay on one particular message. The second thing is that the Chinese can deliver aid, grants quicker and with less oversight. So if I go out to Tonga, for example, was the last country that I went out to, I get a request from the foreign ministry. The steps that I have to go through to resolve that or to deliver, it's a 2-year budget cycle. I have to go through a request that goes to the head of the State Department, then it goes to OMB, then it goes to Congress to approve, and then maybe it'll get budgeted for the next year for a tiny little grant, right? I mean, that is something we need to streamline in the U.S. government to be able to give, whether it's our people on the ground, more of an ability to deliver aid, to deliver resources right away. And then third, whether we like it or not, or what we do about it, right, is China doesn't criticize them on human rights and internal politics. And so having someone at the table that is your partner that is never going to talk to you about the things that you don't want to be talking about is a great advantage. Now, we then have to figure out how do we balance that? Because those issues are important to us. But we do have to figure out how do we balance having those conversations and what we do. And again, that's one we don't have a great answer on, but those are kind of three things that China offers that we have to think about. How do we do this differently?
And have they overplayed their hand in some places, like the Solomon Islands, where they are reputed to have purchased many of the members of the legislature in order to get their special agreement?
They haven't overplayed it in the Solomon Islands. I mean, the current Prime Minister Manele was the foreign minister when they signed that previous agreement, and they're still very much in the influence game in the Solomons. They're in a much better position than we are.
So is that a model then for how the Chinese will operate elsewhere?
Certainly, although they are opportunistic, right? They saw in the previous Prime Minister Sogavare a authoritarian-minded leader of a democratic country that was looking for any opportunity to maintain power, and also the ability to utilize corruption that existed at a certain level and gain influence in that way. So that's not going to work everywhere, but they certainly will take advantage of it where they can.
Any concluding remarks you want to make?
Yeah, I'll let you wrap it up. But I'll say one thing again. I really want to frame the U.S. government to be the facilitator of any kind of work. So I would, whether it's the World War II tourism, or if anyone has any desire to get involved, to get more even just more information, please reach out. I would love to help facilitate, and we do have folks out in the field that are eager to help. So again, I think the number one takeaway for me is that if we do care about this passionately, do not wait for the U.S. government to solve it all.
No, I'll double down on that. I love the framing that Danny gave of the U.S. government being more of a facilitator, not just the doer. I might use that in future writing that I'll do from the think tank side. When I think about some of the main areas that we're not only lacking, but also can make some of the biggest bang for the buck, if you will, it's things like university partnerships, education, business investment, which unlike the Chinese, we can't order our businesses to just go in and do business there, right? But are there ways to facilitate through maybe public-private partnerships to have more strategically minded businesses like Google, for example, recently building their Google Connect cable across the Pacific, came to Australia and U.S. governments and said, hey, we're building this billion-dollar cable. We know that you care about this region strategically. We'll give you the opportunity to just spend a few $1 million and build some spurs off of this cable. This really happened this past year. And for the first time ever, we just connected Tuvalu, a small country of 11,000 people, to internet for the first time ever. And the U.S. government was able to do that in conjunction with partners and allies because Google had the idea to do that. So there are ways that this can work if we have a kind of a whole of nation, not just a whole of government effort. Two other areas that can work, media, health, and it's probably endless opportunities. But echoing Danny, there's a lot of room for creativity and new ideas here. So the more people that are aware of the issue set, I think the better off that we're going to be.
Well, thank you. I must say what you've just said about cultural sensitivity and listening to people is something, it's news to me, and it's wonderful news, and it's smart. But the need for the U.S. government in its many parts to get its act together is also a bit distressing at this late stage. Anyway, I want to thank you both very much for excellent presentations, for giving us the tour of the horizon, and putting us on the map. Thank you very much.